myself, along with other residents here in the BRAC, we were very concerned.
Ernie Scott was the acting district commissioner of the Sister Islands at the time.
And one of the big concerns or reasons for being concerned was the uncertainty as to the track, the projected path of Hurricane Ivan, which resulted in a number of people here from the BRAC leaving the BRAC and going over to Grand Cayman or somewhere further. And we also had a couple of situations with our dive operators. They took their dive boats, their vessels, left the BRAC because we don't have much of a safe harbor here in the BRAC. They felt far more comfortable taking their vessels over to Grand Cayman and putting them in what was thought at the time to be a safe environment, which turned out to be a disaster for a couple of the boats.
Rather than take the path northwest, it continued to drift west and moved south of Grand Cayman. Ivan was regarded as a peak Category 4 hurricane. The National Hurricane Center ran a hurricane hunter into Hurricane Ivan. What they found as a peak wind was the 155, and that puts it at 1 mile per hour below the Category 5 level.
As Hurricane Ivan approached, local meteorologists realized its size and speed were something this generation of Caymanians had never seen before. The 1932 hurricane is the closest comparison, and it ravaged the Cayman Islands, particularly Cayman Brac, with gusts of more than 200 miles per hour, waves up to 50 feet high, and more than 30 feet of storm surge. Keeping a close eye on Hurricane Ivan was the National Hurricane Committee. Donovan Ebanks was the deputy chairman.
Well, we certainly did all of the normal monitoring of the weather, convening meetings probably from a week before Ivan actually got here. The reality was that Ivan was a redefining event. We as human beings largely form our imaginations and our projections based on what we've experienced. And there was no one in Cayman that had experienced anything of the severity of Ivan. And while we thought we were as prepared as we could be, the sobering reality was that when you start experiencing those conditions on the Saturday evening and through the day Sunday, you suddenly realize that there was probably a lot more that we wish we could have done.
As Hurricane Ivan crept closer to the Cayman Islands, preparations in Grand Cayman were getting underway. Chief Inspector Angelique Howell says officers with the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service started bolting down their district stations.
We also gave our officers time to secure their property and their families. We had our hurricane plans in place. We knew where we wanted our officers to be. We also knew that we wanted our officers to be out and about on the streets, because after a certain time, then we started to get people off the streets.
The deputy chairperson of Essential Relief Services, what's known as shelter operations these days, was Jen Dixon. In the days leading up to Hurricane Ivan's arrival, her team was busy making last-minute preparations.
We had, for several days before Ivan, maintained contact with our shelter managers as well as our food suppliers to let them know there was a system we were monitoring and that we might need to mobilize. And also for our shelter management teams, encouraging them any personal preparations that they had not completed as yet to get all that done in readiness, so when the call came to mobilize, we would be ready to get into gear.
Every year, the Health Services Authority carries out general hurricane preparedness, and 2004 was no exception. Hazel Brown is the chief nursing officer now, but 10 years ago, she was the nurse manager in specialist services.
All of our supplies for the district medical centers, everything is ready so that on the 1st of June, each emergency medical center's kit is ready. So when we get the actual storm watch, those kits start to go out to the emergency medical centers.
Mike Adam was the head of Cayman Airways.
We actually started what we call an airlift evacuating tourists and residents starting on Thursday, the 9th of September, when the threat was issued. And that continued for 48 hours. We moved about roughly on the jet flights, back and forth, primarily to the U.S. mainland, about 3,500, 4,000 people. We continued the air evacuation until late Friday evening, when the winds practically shut down the airport, so to speak. And we all returned to our homes and got ready for the arrival of Ivan on Saturday.
Back in 2004, the Cayman National Cultural Foundation was still working out of the Harkwell Theatre. But as managing director of CNCF, Marcia Mutu points out, it's a different structure then than the one that sits there today.
We did all of the usual preparations We'd had many trial runs of how to prepare, sandbags down, windows boarded as best we could, documents put away. And, the Harquail has these huge glass doors. We couldn't batten all of those doors down, but we did our best to make sure that if there was any water rising up, it wouldn't come through those doors. But I really don't think anybody could have prepared themselves for the experience of going through the storm.
In West Bay, firefighters like John Bodden were trying to get people to higher ground in anticipation of landfall.
Once I arrived at the West Bay station on the Saturday prior to the storm, we started to take the fire trucks and go to the low-lying areas to warn people to go to higher grounds. I mean, that's basic protocol. No one wants to leave their things behind. Once the storm start coming in, then you start getting phone calls. I need you to come get me. I need you to come get me. At some point, then it'd be too late.
Meanwhile, folks over at telecommunications provider Cable and Wireless, Lime as it's known now, were doing everything they could to ensure calls could be made to emergency services during and after the storm. Julie Hutton was the events manager during Hurricane Ivan.
We prepared as absolutely the best we could. It was a very different situation at the time because we'd just built One Technology Square, which was our hurricane building. It's Category 5 rated, but it wasn't finished. We went through our absolute hurricane preparation, but we'd been watching that storm, and it was the size of the Caribbean. I mean, I can remember saying, even if this misses us, it's still going to cause a lot of damage because it was huge. I came into One Technology Square around about 1 o'clock on the Saturday, and people were coming in. You were bringing your bed, everything so that you could live, actually, for the next, we thought, couple of days. That turned into a lot longer than a couple of days, as you know.
All the old signs were there. The fruit trees had bore heavily that year. The waters were extra warm, and all the things that my mother had told me I was watching.
The Honorable Makiva Bush was the leader of government business in September of 2004.
I said to the governor, look, this is not normal. Please, let's put some things in place now. And he said, no, you got to wait on the hurricane committee till we get the word go. On Thursday, I said, guess what? You can stay in this glass house. I am going to West Bay now to start take care of my old people and those that can't help themselves. Friday evening, I went to the North Sound to test the water. And it was hot. I mean, hot. You could have mixed tea on it. And I said to my mother, she said, that's a big sign. We're going to get this.
There were signs in the district of East End as well, where Henry Harris lives.
A few weeks before the storm, I was out snorkeling. It was so strange because the visibility was 150 feet almost. There were strong current in places where there never used to be any current on the inside of the reef. The coral heads didn't have no fish. The conchs were 3 or 4 thick, piled up in little groups. I came ashore and I told my friend, I said, boss, I don't know what's going on, but things are strange out there.
In Georgetown, Premier the Honorable Alden McLaughlin was trying to take care of his own constituents as a member of the opposition at the time.
I don't think it was until the day before that it really dawned on everyone that this was going to be a major event. I remember that evening we had been out trying to help people in vulnerable homes, security places. But I think we all thought we understood what the force of a hurricane actually was. But nothing I think could have prepared us for what Ivan actually was.
At 10 a.m. on September 11th, 2004, the Cayman Islands was under a hurricane warning, with tropical storm winds starting to hit the sister islands. Hurricane Ivan was 200 miles southeast of Grand Cayman. Director General of the National Weather Service, John Tibbetts.
Before Hurricane Ivan hit, it was a Category 5 hurricane. Coming off of Jamaica, and as it approached the Cayman Islands, it was a Category 5 hurricane. We were getting hurricane force winds in the eastern districts, and that storm was still a Category 5 hurricane. But the worst of any hurricane is always in those eye walls. By the time those eye walls got to the Cayman Islands, the storm had weakened from a Category 5 hurricane to a peak Category 4 hurricane.
By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the storm had moved 50 miles closer, shifting farther south than anticipated. At 10 p.m., Grand Cayman was hit with 130-mile-per-hour winds, with Ivan only 113 miles away. Over at the hospital, Nurse Hazel Brown was dealing with an unexpected influx of people trying to escape the wind, the rain, and the flooding.
More and more people started coming in to shelter. And when we closed the doors on Saturday night, I think we started off here with about 500 people sheltering. And on Sunday night, after the worst of it, we were up to about 800, 900 people sheltering. We were overwhelmed with people seeking shelter after the hurricane. There is no time to be terrified. You do what has to be done with what you have at hand. It was all about improvising to meet the demands of the crisis.
Like when the power went out, Karen Pinnock was one of the intensive care unit nurses taking care of a man who was hooked up to a ventilator.
We were taking turns to bag him. He just manually pressed a bag. Same way how he would breathe, take a breath in and out. He would have to bag the breath in for him, then let it go, so he breathes out. And so we have to do that. All our ventilators didn't, at the time, they didn't have any backup batteries. So we bag him all day from morning till in the night. Those of us who were not on duty, we would still have to come and help. We had no choice. And the gentleman survived.
Other emergency services workers were also finding themselves facing extreme conditions. Inspector Angelique Howell was hunkering down at Bodentown Police Station.
I ended up there for 3 days. Living in water, knee high, basically sitting on top of a desk, because the place was flooded. It was really, really bad. We had the cemetery uprooted, and we had coffin coming over into the station yard, knocking out the station door. So we had to live there with a coffin in the station yard for a few days.
And then it started to really pick up. Then the water keep rising into the fire station. There was nowhere for us to go now.
In West Bay, John Bodden says he and his fellow firefighters were quickly finding themselves in need of rescuing.
The water line eventually rised to chest deep. Then some of the fire officers, like their family came there and like with young kids and all that. So we end up having to put them inside the fire truck, just to get them to the real higher grounds. And some of the fire officers had to go on top of the fire truck. Then it got kind of scary for us,
Hurricane Ivan lingered over Grand Cayman. By 4 a.m. on Sunday morning, 18 hours after tropical storm force winds were first felt in the sister islands, Ivan was 61 miles southeast of Grand Cayman, and hurricane storm force winds were in full effect. Storm surge from the North Sound saw waves of 8 to 10 feet rushing across the island. At this point, Richard Hugh and his team at Caribbean Utilities Company had to cut the power.
I think there was one circuit on into the wee hours of Sunday morning, but then there were too many faults on, so we shut the system down, and then it's just like everyone else, you hunker down and wait for the storm to pass. And we tried coming out on a Sunday evening, but the winds were still too high, and there was quite a bit of flooding.
Sunday morning, September 12th, at 10 a.m., Hurricane Ivan was at its closest point to Grand Cayman, a mere 21 miles away with winds of up to 150 miles per hour. With storm surge carrying waves of up to 30 feet high by some reports, Cayman was getting battered, including the shelters being carefully monitored by Jen Dixon.
Out in Bodentown, the sea came across the road and was actually getting into the shelter. So in the middle of the storm, they had to rig up something to move the people from there down to Bodentown. God bless people like Charlie Powell and many others who were out there using ropes to ferry people from the shelter into buses to get them down to Bodentown to safety. They had to do that. It's not the ideal, but because of the conditions, they had to move people. There were persons who tried to get to the shelter after the worst of the storm started. One gentleman got injured on his way to the shelter because, of course, he was moving through floodwaters with objects floating around, got battered. Regrettably, he subsequently died from those injuries. We had the Islay Connolly Hall. The roof went on that. All we could do at that point is to ask the shelter manager to move the people to the furthest area in that hall where the roof was still intact until, we could sort something further out for them. So there are a lot of issues. One of the most heartrending things where we were also getting calls for help, for rescue, for people to come out. You could hear that on the radio coming in. Persons who did not evacuate from areas when they were told to evacuate, and because of the magnitude of the storm, water was rising in their homes. Some people went into the rafters in their homes to survive.
And there they had to wait. Some rescue operations were carried out during the storm, but Chief Inspector Angelique Howell says it just got too dangerous.
We rescue with bus, we rescue with tractors, we rescue with all sorts of heavy equipment. But there comes a time when we have to put our officers' safety in front, and we have to say, no, I'm sorry, we won't be able to come out to rescue you.
One of the fire officers, he was very upset because the last time he heard from his family, the roof was being torn off of the house. It brought tears to his eyes.
Wayne Whitlock was one of the main firemen stationed in Georgetown at the Hurricane Command Center.
When the eye came by, we decided we needed to go look for his family. We took one of the foam tender trucks and we went into the Fairbanks area. When we got to the house, he didn't see his family, and then we heard them calling from across the way. So once we found that they were okay, we proceeded to just do a little bit of rescuing from the people that were in flooded homes. It wasn't a lot of time to work with, but we brought 20 odd personnel to the station. We had to do things very fast, rapidly, quickly. Then we got the call saying, the winds are picking up again. We need to return back to the station.
By 1 p.m. on Sunday, Hurricane Ivan was 41 miles west of Grand Cayman, and hurricane force winds continued to hit the island with huge breaking waves and severe beach erosion. Over in East End, Henry Harris, his wife, and 2 children were listening to the storm build in strength.
It was something that I will always remember. Just the pressure on the house. I have a fairly big, strong house. You could literally feel the pressure of the wind on the house. It was scary. You're hearing things like limbs cracking and sink coming off of roofs and things like that. The windows keep clanking, the garage doors were banging, and the children was crying, and my windows, I had the plywood made up as shutters, and one of them has sucked off, and the window was coming out, so I had to go outside to try to repair that in the middle of the storm. That was the most frightening and awful thing that I ever did, to open that door to go out. Trying to come back in with that piece of wood was horrific. I remember having to lie on the porch and crawl to get back to the door.
6 weeks before the devastation of Hurricane Ivan, church leader with the Seventh-day Adventist Conference, Rohan Riley, was celebrating one of the most joyous occasions of his life, the birth of his second daughter. On September 12th, he found himself doing everything he could to keep his young family alive.
It was my wife and myself, our 6-week-old baby, our 2-year-old daughter. About 11 of us who bunkered down that night. A bunch of people ranging from 6 weeks to 80 years huddled together, listening to the howling of the wind outside. And then to make it worse for us, one of the awnings got ripped off and started to bang against the wall. And so it was the banging and the howling and the wind. It was really a terrifying sound that we just listened to and with nothing to do and nowhere to go, just huddling together. I remember at one point, the little 2-year-old daughter, she started singing. She started singing hymns.
Light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
There was a point after several hours of this storm howling around us and just, battering the building, that you just felt like it was you. It was, it was definitely coming for you, because it's only so long, I think, that people can be optimistic and cheerful and so on under those circumstances.
As she and her family waited for Hurricane Ivan to pass, Marcia Mutu says Radio Cayman was a beacon through the storm.
We were with good friends and listened to Radio Cayman for several hours. Mr. Loxley speaking and sort of helping us to prepare, but also people calling in and talking about how they were alone at home and how the water was coming up and how terrifying it was for them and what should they do, the water rising in their own homes. And so you felt for folks.
Jay Earhart was a news editor with Radio Cayman back in September 2004.
It starts to get really bad. I mean, the wind starts coming in and the rain starts howling, and Joel Francis and I decided, let's get a pulse of how the people feel. Let's find out what's going around in the country. Let's start Talk Today now. And so we decided to open the phones and hear from you, the people. There's one phone call that it still sticks with me to this day. There was a woman that called, and she was from Red Bay area, and she's got her baby in her hands, and she's on top of the kitchen counter. The water's up to her knees. Her roof is off, and she's asking us what to do. We did what we thought was best in telling her how to stay put, and you tell her to just ride it out and do the best she can. And We asked for exact address, and we said if there's a neighbor directly next door that has the ability to help, please go next door and help. It was at that point that I realized why certain people go out in the middle of a storm and die in a storm, because if that had been my family, nothing but death would have stopped me from helping them.
In the meantime, over in Cayman Brac, the phone lines started to fail.
Never forget when we started losing communication.
Ernie Scott was the acting district commissioner of the Sister Islands.
Cell phones going down, radio contact lost, anxiety filling the air, concern. Some people started even to cry because they just didn't know what to expect, and fear took over in some cases for the people that were over in Grand Cayman, more so than we here in the Brac.
Over at One Technology Square, Tim Adam and his team at Cable and Wireless were doing everything they could to keep the lines open.
We were required to be in there, a group of us, and it was a good, safe shelter. I mean, One Technology Square at the time was still pretty much a building site, but the third floor, which is where personnel were to be housed during such an emergency, was almost complete. It wasn't quite, but it was complete enough that it could house us. The good thing was that by being in One Technology Square, though, we were able to be right there on top of the situation when various things were going on around the country and within the network, so that we could respond and keep systems going and keep communication going.
In the lead up to the storm, 911 phone lines had to move into the building, and Julie Houghton with Cable and Wireless was asked to help take calls.
They sat us down and briefed us before we started to answer the calls. This is what you've got to say. You cannot say we are going out to rescue anybody at this moment in time. You know, it's a case of we find out where you are, how many people in the house, that sort of thing. So as soon as it was safe, we could get out there. I actually went on and started answering calls, and you just couldn't answer the volume. I was on the phone for 2 hours, and I had over 70 missed calls, and I was answering calls one after the other.
Right.
But that was extremely traumatic. It was, people were terrified, they were screaming, they'd got elderly people, they'd got disabled people, they'd got children, they were telling you that they were drowning. I mean, it really was traumatic. We were wondering what on earth we were going to walk out to when it passed. So I came off the phone, called my son, and I was just in floods of tears. I don't know what's going to happen, and it's just, it was terrible.
I never thought you could actually see breeze. You actually saw the breeze. I mean, it's the salt spray and all, and the rain and all of that, but the force of that was just absolutely incredible.
Premier, the Honourable Alden McLaughlin, rode out the storm at his home in Prospect Park.
It was without a doubt the roughest, most frightening night I've ever spent. And I looked outside and I saw this river of water, and I said, where in the devil is this water coming from? And then something went off in my head, and I took my finger and I stuck it in the water, which was on my porch at this point. And I tasted it and I said, my God, it's the sea. Instantly I understood where it had come from. What had happened is it had breached the shore over on spots, and that had met the sea coming from the north-south. I live in Prospect Park, but right at the front end of Prospect Park, a long ways away from the sea. It actually floated my wife's car. That's when I knew we were in big trouble, and I said to her, water's coming inside this house today. And it did. And then the next day, when the sun rose and you could actually start to see the magnitude of the destruction, what came home to me so strongly then was my responsibility. I was not a member of the government, but I was a member of the opposition and representative for Georgetown, and I just knew what this was going to mean.
It wasn't until Monday morning that the winds started to leave Grand Cayman. Director General of the National Weather Service, John Tibbetts.
The tropical storm force winds, when it began until when it ended, is something in the order of about 36, 42 hours. However, there are other things that go on with the hurricane. For example, the all clear was not given immediately after the tropical storm force wind stopped. We were still getting some very large seas on the west coast in particular from Hurricane Ivan, which let's not forget that it was re-strengthening as it went west of here. So if you're just measuring it from start of tropical storm force winds to the end of tropical storm force winds, it's one thing. But if you're starting it from when you're starting to see the clouds and showers and what have you until you get that beautiful sunshine again, that's a different thing altogether. That time period may have been 3 days.
At that point, I had 2 young children. My son was only 2 years old, so I had to leave my son at home and my daughter with a helper. So I didn't know if they were living or if they were dead. I just didn't know. When we did get an opportunity and it seems to die down, we started to walk. And I remember when I saw my children, the first thing I could do was just burst out crying.
It's a story that is all too familiar for Cayman's emergency services personnel. Chief Inspector Angelique Howell was one of hundreds of first responders who emerged from the storm with no idea how their families had fared through Hurricane Ivan. In West Bay, Fire Officer John Bodden was determined to find his loved ones.
Because we lost all communications, we couldn't talk to the main central fire station. We couldn't talk to our families. We couldn't talk to no one. Then you start hearing rumors you have 100 odd people dead in Georgetown. You have 100 odd people dead in East End. We made I call it executive decision to try to make it into Georgetown. Even we had to shovel our way through. We saw a guy with a truck from the Water Authority. But I guess we used our powers and apprehended that vehicle to make it into Georgetown. When we got to Public Beach, we couldn't pass. We made a turn by Indy Street. And then we realized that there was a lot of trees down. So we just started cutting trees and removing them and making road through people backyards. And then when we got into Governor's Harbor, we realized just like in the movies, you start seeing humongous boats just stuck in trees, containers all over the place, vehicles all over the place.
Meanwhile, the cabinet secretary at the time, Orrick Connor, was pulling out of the fire station in Georgetown, which housed the Emergency Operations Center.
We wanted to first survey government buildings to see what it was like. And that is when you started to see the real devastation that had taken place. It was really quite a jarring moment when you saw all of that. Then you saw crowds of people just walking. There were people who had been housed at the hospital and various other buildings, and they were walking, most of them aimlessly on the street. You could see that, they were going through a period of shock.
With the massive overflow of people who sheltered at the Georgetown Hospital, Nurse Hazel Brown and the HSA staff now faced a new problem.
We didn't have food. We couldn't feed people, and those who came at the very outset, the ones who came in specifically to shelter, came with their food supplies. Now, nobody expected it to last as long as it did. By Monday, when we had the influx of people from the neighborhood who had been flooded, and then everybody who had food had shared food, it was starting to run out.
Everybody around the neighborhood was walking around inspecting the damage and asking me, what are we going to do?
In Prospect Park, opposition member Alden McLaughlin was coming to grips with the reality of the situation.
It's a huge, overwhelming feeling to have that level of responsibility and expectation placed in you by people you represent, and then to have nothing to say to them because you just don't know. That first day was just absolute trauma.
After finally getting to Georgetown and making contact with his wife, Fire Officer John Bodden led an effort to clear the roads heading east.
I decided, we'll try to make our way into Newlands. To my surprise, we bucked up in the Mariners Cove, sitting in the middle of the road. So then there was a major operation going on, a search and rescue, because at the time we didn't know if anyone made it out of that condo. It was just one big rumble in the middle of the road.
Luckily, no one was in the Mariners Cove condo when it was washed onto the road. People inside evacuated to Prospect Primary School. Cayman's building code was amended in 1999 to force new building construction to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. Mariners Cove was built before those amendments went into effect. Director of Planning, Haroon Panduhi.
In Mariners Cove, you've had a wooden structure. Fundamentally, the building was removed and separated from the foundation. A lot of the damage was caused by tidal, the waves coming on shore, and that's, as I said, very difficult to build against and very costly to try to manage that. But in the case of Mariners Cove, now you get into issues of, the wood structure being secured to the foundation, properly strapped and anchored to make sure that, in effect, the structure holds together. against, the forces of the wind and sort of the other environmental factors.
The Eastern Districts weren't spared any of Ivan's wrath, and Henry Harris was stunned when he walked out of his house.
I was in a daze when I got out there because when my wife came to me, I was sitting in the middle of the road, and I don't know whether I flipped. I don't know what happened, because I had never seen East End so bare in all of my life. There was a huge grape tree that was on a property that belongs to us just maybe 200 yards from my house. A huge tree. It would take maybe 2 big men to span the body of the tree. That tree was over 100 years old. That tree has gone. Me and my son decided that we would go down to the bigger district to see what was happening, because we figured that for what we were seeing there, that would have to be casualties. When we got there, a lot of debris in the road. There were fish, there were pieces of boats, all sorts of stuff. So we got down there, we met a few people and said, well, to their recollection, they haven't had no reports, but there's a lot of bodies out of the graveyard. We went over there, walked across. The stench was very high, and it was surprising. I always say, in all my lifetime, I never saw a dead man pray, but there were a skeleton that was out of the casket, and this person were in a kneeling position.
Back in West Bay, the leader of the country was getting mobilized.
We got to police station. They didn't know. They said they had some reports that there was a lot of people dead. They didn't know. They had lost contact. They was underwater. So someone, Peter Campbell, had a truck that was working. We started trying to get to the headquarters to get to the governor. But it took me something like 2.5 hours to get to the governor, but because I had to go through the swamp. I got to the governor. That's about 12 o'clock. The governor took me in his little office or whatever, the room that he was in. He broke down. And I said, Governor, we are going to roll up our sleeves and get this island back on track. And he said, whatever we can do, we can do it.
The governor was Bruce Dinwiddie, who took to the Radio Cayman airwaves in the hours following the storm to update the country.
I have immediately imposed a curfew. This curfew runs from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and is imposed throughout Grand Cayman. I shall be chairing a meeting of the Cabinet tomorrow afternoon to discuss these and other matters, and especially the massive task of recovery and reconstruction which confronts us. I also hope to arrange tomorrow afternoon a meeting with all the members of the Legislative Assembly. The task before us transcends politics. I know that all members will wish to work together with me and other members of Cabinet, supported by our excellent public service and volunteers from within our community. We are meanwhile doing all we can to ensure that essential services, especially water and power, are restored as quickly as possible. And other actions that will be or have been taken include the following. Particularly, I should say first, care for the homeless. Arrangements are being made for shelter and food to be made available. Arrangements are being made for emergency canteens to be set up at various locations. These will be able to provide meals for persons needing food.
Orrit Connor was appointed as the recovery manager after Hurricane Ivan. He says one of the first priorities was getting people off the island.
Because remember, we had a mix of tourists still on the island because we weren't able to get everyone off the island. We had people, families with young children who were concerned, about the availability of food and water. You had businesses who wanted to relocate, set up offices elsewhere so they could continue to conduct business for the Cayman Islands. So we had a mixture of some companies chartering jets to take people out, but we also had Cayman Airways. They decided we're going to get people out of here. We will deal with the government later in terms of being paid for whatever is done, but they were just basically taking people out.
We planned to start operating on Tuesday morning.
Chief Executive Officer of the National Airline, Mike Adam, was at the airport at sunrise.
Practically no one around, except I found one guy out there in front of the terminal. He was trying to clear debris, on the roadway in front of the terminal with a forklift. And I said, hey, we need to get this runway cleared. I guess it was around early afternoon, 1 o'clock, when Civil Aviation declared the runway safe. We had cleared all the debris off. And actually, we were also setting up a command post from Tuesday morning. When we came in, we said, the terminal was unusable. So we elected to use what was left of the Cayman Airways maintenance hangar. We set that up as a temporary terminal, so to speak. And the first flight then came in around 1 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, and I recall we kept that open for medical emergencies, and there were quite a number, I would say at least 50 to 60 high-risk patients that were on life support that we declared that first flight would be dedicated primarily for those folks.
While crews at the airport worked on getting people off the island, a team with Caribbean Utilities Company made its way downtown from the North Sound plant, and it became obvious to Richard Hugh what they needed to focus on right away.
Looked at all the critical service areas that we had to cover, first of all, to restore power to those. And I realized that we had at least a week of work in this area alone. So we had I think on the Wednesday, we had the airport, which had the National Hurricane Command Center as well. So it was important to restore that area. And by Thursday, we were into parts of Georgetown. By Saturday, we were, along to the fuel depots. So we picked up most of the critical services within the first week.
Meanwhile, fellow utility company Cable & Wireless was rolling out its own recovery effort with help from the regional office in Panama. But CEO Tim Adam was facing a unique challenge: how to deal with the influx of people who had fled to One Technology Square to survive the storm.
We welcomed them in to make sure they were safe through the storm. We saw them through the storm, but after that we weren't in any way equipped to be a shelter and to be able to house people. So that was a challenge, because we had people from the community come in during the storm, and now we're saying, look, we need to get back in. At that point, our focus had to be on securing the facility and doing the recovery work and getting organized to do the recovery work. And with what was going on all around us in Georgetown at the time, the looting and so on became somewhat of a concern as to what could that mean for a site such as this. And as I say, reached out to the police and said, we need more. But it turned out the police themselves were pretty much strapped.
As a police department, we were displaced because we lost some of our buildings. Georgetown Police Station was actually flooded on the first floor. We had problems with the roof caving in. So, it was just a complete displacement for us at that point.
Chief Inspector Angelique Howell says police options were limited.
Most of our other police areas, buildings that we used were damaged. So we had to work out of the now Lime building. We actually stayed there for almost a year because we did not have anywhere else to go.
In addition to finding a new home for the Royal Cayman Islands Police Service, former Cabinet Secretary Orette Connor says top government officials found themselves homeless as well.
It was important for us to find somewhere for the government to meet. Also, the politicians who were in opposition at that time came up to the command center because everyone basically wanted to throw their hat in the ring and assist. So after Cabinet met, it was determined that we really couldn't meet in the government administration building because it was leaking. But we actually started to hold cabinet meetings over in the Hugh Moses' offices. And of course, once a state of emergency had been declared, then it meant that the governor was running the country as opposed to the legislature.
The governor says, I'm going to take charge and I am setting up a state of emergency, so I will be running the country. I said, well, what about us?
Mr. Bush says the governor soon turned to the local leaders for help.
Within days, he couldn't get anything done, so he gave back authority to us, to each ministry. But it was a terrible, terrible time. But what was good was the camaraderie. There was no us and them. Alan Moore and his brother at the mango tree, they fed hundreds of people.
I don't know quite how it happened, but somehow Kurt and myself wound up being responsible for the distribution of all the food and water in the district of Georgetown.
Georgetown Representative Alden McLaughlin says they took over a Georgetown school as their base of operations.
We managed to recruit teachers. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, we had an army of volunteers, most of the teachers, but not just teachers, who come and help us pack the bundles of stuff to deliver.
Under normal circumstances, Department of Environment Marine Enforcement Officer Mark Orr would have arrested and charged anyone taking fish, lobster, and conch from protected zones. But these were hardly normal circumstances.
We knew that a lot of people needed food out there, so we actually did relax the restrictions on the marine conservation law. You know, if it was season, it was eased up, limits were eased up. And we had a lot of people who went out and got a good amount or a normal amount for food. However, we unfortunately still face, every 1 in 20 people that we found out there was coming in with 100 conch or 20 lobster, and we had a lot of stories of people actually selling the stuff to people in need. Not actually sharing the stuff out with their family, but actually trying to make money and actually charging 3 times the normal rate for it because there weren't that many boats, for example, that could still go out at the time. Those persons were still arrested. Cases didn't go to trial for quite a while. Everything was put on hold because the courthouse was damaged, of course.
As each district started its recovery efforts, East End benefited from a $5 million donation from Susan Oldie. Henry Harris.
Thanks to Miss Oldie for helping the East End people. She must be commended very highly. And East End were actually some of the first that came online with houses. They were containers of ice and all this kind of thing, water, generators freely, even petrol that were being donated, special flights coming in, all this kind of thing after they get to the airport. East End were really blessed with the help that we got.
After finding somewhere safe for his wife, 2-year-old and 6-week-old daughters after their terrifying experience during the storm, Rohan Riley with the Seventh-day Adventist Conference immediately met with fellow church leaders to bring relief to those hit hardest by Hurricane Ivan.
We set up what we call a resource center and in a soup kitchen. We did this in the Prospect area where people could come and have a warm meal. We had some clothing that had been provided by ATRA, which people could look around and see if there was anything that they needed. And so that provided some sort of immediate relief. We organized a crew of young men who would go around and help folks who wanted to clear their yard or wanted to get their houses repaired. We had someone who took a camera along so they could help them record, the damages for insurance purposes.
The overall loss for Ivan was about $2 billion, of which $1 billion was in insurance.
Nigel Toohey was the president of the Insurance Association.
The main issue was, of course, the amount of damage. There was something like probably 90% of people in Cayman suffered some sort of damage. Either they lost their car, some damage to their homes, their business, interruption either through wind, your roof would have been blown off, your car would have been drowned if it was sitting at the airport or in many places. We were looking at roofs flying around. Someone whose house was fine for most of the time until their neighbour's roof hit their roof. We would have photographs of people's cars floating into their living rooms, and it was just that overall enormous amount of damage to people and disruption to their lives.
Responsible for assessing the damage, teams with the planning department bulked up by dozens of volunteers were trying their best to get the buildings still standing back in action. Director of Planning, Haroon Panduhi.
How do we get those up and running and get electricity going? How do we start to assist in restoring sort of the basic necessities of life and assisting where we could through inspections, mainly electrical inspections, ensuring structural integrity of buildings, because there was a lot of wash through. So you were faced with buildings that on the surface looked fine, but as they say, behind the walls was a different story. So we had to initially make sure that they could be re-energized, but then that they were safe, they were habitable at the end of the day.
Thousands of homes were damaged, leaving hundreds of people with nowhere to live but in the shelters for weeks and for some months.
When we went to the shelters, we realized that people were just down. Some had just lost everything that they had.
Rohan Riley says the Seventh-day Adventist Conference wanted to let people know there was still hope.
We still knew that God cared for us enough to preserve our life when, based on what happened, we could have had hundreds of people die. We decided to start a series of concerts in the shelters, of inspirational concerts where we got singers together to go and sing and to relate to the folks, let them know that, listen, have a smile, praise God despite everything, and have hope that tomorrow's going to be better.
The Deputy Chairperson of Essential Relief Services, Jen Dixon, says all in all, 3,094 people in Grand Cayman used the shelters during and after Hurricane Ivan.
It was overwhelming at times. We had people who were
totally homeless who left the shelters, who came back because there was nothing there. So we actually had people in shelters up until I think about the 22nd of December. And those 29 persons who were left there, our promise to them was they wouldn't be in the shelter for Christmas.
During his initial address to the country, Governor Dinwiddie had promised international relief from his counterparts in the United Kingdom.
I've been in contact with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Department for International Development, the United Nations Development Programme Office in Jamaica, and through the FCO in London with fellow governors from other Caribbean overseas territories on the question of assistance which can be provided to us. 2 British Navy ships are already standing by a few miles offshore and will be sending an advance party to assist in relief efforts shortly. They've not yet been able to land because of the rough seas, but we hope to receive them here very soon. A word on security. I'm hoping that Navy personnel from the British vessels will be deployed on the island very shortly in support of the RCIP.
But as recovery manager Orrit Connor tells it, that help never materialized.
The UK, they had the warship and a supply ship that was on its way here, and we had great expectations that they would be able to assist us when they got here. Unfortunately, Grenada was also hit, and since this ship was located in the Eastern Caribbean and moving towards the west, they had already depleted whatever resources they had. So when they got here, they had absolutely very little or nothing, for us. At the end of the day, we ended up getting, and they may say to us, well, you got that because we helped to lobby, for that, and because we're part of the European Union. But the $3-something million that we got to rebuild homes, from the European Union, we got more from them than we got from the UK. When the looting took place, I recall crossing Foster's, and Foster's had an armed guard out there with a shotgun to protect their premises, and several people had to employ that tactic. What we were hoping for, that the UK would provide some level of security, here for us. We don't know what the reluctance for that was, whether or not, image standpoint, having soldiers in one of the overseas territories establishing order, whether or not there was some pushback from the people in the military. But the request was made, and we never got it whatsoever.
Days following Hurricane Ivan, everybody was like living as one.
Angelique Howell with the RCIPS says despite the initial solidarity, as the recovery effort dragged on, it brought out the best and the worst in people.
As the weeks go by, we find that we had increase in criminality. You find the thefts go up. We had a curfew on until December because people were just taking advantage of people's property at that point and things, and people themselves. Domestic violence actually rise to 150%. People were just fighting at home. It was just a really, really bad time. We were at the stage where we couldn't, as a police department, handle all of the challenges. We had to recruit approximately 300 volunteers. We also had persons like soldiers and other police department within the region that actually came here to assist us as well.
And the police weren't the only agency to call in overseas help. Nurse Hazel Brown had friends in Canada.
We got a group of volunteers who came from Hamilton Health Sciences, primarily nurses, but also physicians, counselors, who came, and then they could then relieve the staff that we did have remaining to go and get their homes together and get their lives back together. And of course, we didn't get many admissions. We didn't have a lot of injuries or anything, so we didn't get many admissions, so we stayed at a very low occupancy for some time.
Medical Director of Health, Dr. Kiran Kumar, says the potential for disaster was there, but fortunately, Cayman was not host at the time to mosquito-borne illnesses.
The good thing is we did not have dengue in the Cayman Islands. So unless there is a virus, the mosquitoes cannot catch it to transmit it. So that's the reason why we were lucky that not to have any mosquito-borne diseases. In the first month after the Hurricane Ivan, there were about 17 deaths or so. That was a little bit higher compared to the usual monthly figures. So we reviewed, but most of them are all either lung disease, a heart disease, or a cancer, or renal failure, like that. Only 2 cases could possibly be attributed. One gentleman went to, when we are high in the storm, went to rescue his boat in the water, so he could never return back. Another one, there was one gentleman, I think there was a roof collapse, and then he had injuries to the chest, and later on died. So those are the two who comes to my mind that are attributable.
There are various reports on just how many people died as a result of Hurricane Ivan. But according to a United Nations report issued shortly after the storm hit, at least 92 deaths could be directly attributed to Hurricane Ivan around the region.
One more time,
Gimme Story 2004 was the first public event in Cayman after Hurricane Ivan. And I still to this day believe it was the best Gimme Story. People were longing for some opportunity to come back together again. I mean, it has happened, we weathered it, and here we are still as a people with a strong culture, and we're not going to let it pull us down. So many people turned out. There was such warm feelings. There had to be a couple thousand people that turned out. And normally Gimme Story is extremely popular, but you know, we have between 300 and 500 people at the different venues. We wouldn't have the whole 2,000 people turn out one night.
As the recovery effort continued, spirits started lifting, and Grand Cayman saw itself reborn, stronger, safer, better, and inspired. Artists and musicians across the island took the hardships from Hurricane Ivan and immortalized them on canvas, in song, and through poetry.
Curfew gone, the curfew gone. I can stay out as late as I want. No police to chase me down and telling me I'm doing wrong. I work at late in the night, and driving home I always get in a fright. Out of the bush, from out of nowhere, red and blue light flash wrong and wrong in the air. Curfew gone, the curfew gone. I can stay out as late as I want. No police to chase me down and telling me I'm doing wrong. Out of the Babylon car comes an Englishman, waving the baton like if he's a Don. Where's your ID? Where do you work? Where are you going? And don't you smoke? Curfew gone.
Ivan blew from the north, south, east, and west. Proof say him bad, not a minute he rest. You better stay put, say your prayers, close your eyes. It's the only way that you could survive. Arena's Cove, take over, spot straight. Ivan back down, Mr. Creighton's gate. Many routes disappear like flying saucer. But wait, Ivan seen it, ten for linger. Immigration wang no give him visa with lightning force. Ivan broke window, north song and south song. Join Make River, Red Bay and Prospect 6 feet under. Man, the whole top floor, Casper Center is gone. Mr. G's Baba Stock stand all alone. Top paper shingle flying out like dirt. Ivan rage far worse than Mr. Gilbert. This storm had no warning, the fury it brings. At 165 it destroys.
The nightmare?
Oh, I think we all did. Grandpa.
And the Fuzzy Man.
Representing 2004 I-1. I-1, you're gone, but we still yeah.
What a nightmare.
What a nightmare. I had a dream. Oh, you just said nightmare, and I talking about dream.
No, Ivan was definitely a nightmare.
Definitely, man. I tell you something. My country, not my country, but our country was under attack by breeze and water. You sure that water? Was it? I saw a roof flying through the air like Cayman Airways.
And I think one of those roofs were mine.
Whether it belonged to you or it belonged to her or him, boy, I was frightened.
But at least we're survivors.
We not talking about no group in the 80s either.
And we're still here.
So why was we boy? We not talking about Destiny's Child either. I tell you something, nobody out there should complain. You's alive to hear me and Fuzzer sing that we survivors.
I was hanging on to my rafters the whole time.
What happened to my Westar dish? My glass bucket that I used to fish? What happened to my cat?
Ivan come to Cayman, mash up all of the land with a lot of destruction. He blow with winds of 165, but it felt like gusts of 205. Thank God we still alive. What a rush in my home. Ivan just a loom. How sad my roof was not waterproof. Everywhere I look I see blue tarp. Hurricane Ivan has surely left his mark. Insurance man, here's my claim. Who's to blame? What a shame. Not a cent to pay my rent. My nice car wash afar. So many people left on their jet. Wait a sec, not just yet.
As time moved on, it became apparent that some of the recovery would take years. General elections originally scheduled for November 2004 were held in May the following year. Alden McLaughlin found himself in the new ruling government and responsible for Cayman's crippled school system.
They were months before kids actually got back to school. John Gray was so badly damaged that children from that school were actually housed in the Agape Worship Center for many months. And with respect to what was then the middle school, before I took office, they developed a shift system for kids going to school because the property was so badly damaged that it couldn't accommodate all of the kids on campus at one time, which resulted in not only a compressed period of time, couldn't give kids the full diet of educational and after-school programs. And so one of the great first challenges that I had was to try to find a way to get the school plan back functioning so that children could resume sort of normal education. And it was not a quick fix. It took more than a year.
And the school system wasn't the only thing that would need a long time to recover. Marine Enforcement Officer Mark Orr.
We did have a lot of scouring on the deeper reefs, like where you have the persons know what I mean when I say spur and groove, but lines of coral heads with the sand strips in the middle. A lot of that sand was washed out, so we had areas where there was sometimes 8 and 10 feet of just scoured coral in between them where the sand was. And of course a lot of that sand is that sand that we found in homes in South Sound and Bodden Town on the south coast there. On those sides of the islands we had a lot of conch and lobster washed up out of sea, fish. It was flooding right across the island. So I mean we found tarpon, for example, from pretty sure from the North Sound on 7 Mile Beach kicking around on the sand, even a week later in puddles. So it definitely had a major impact. Also the land animals. I mean, a lot of our birds died in Ivan because there was just no way. I mean, they tried to huddle in trees, and of course, were just blown away or blown down. So there was several bird species that were highly impacted by Ivan, and I remember slowly seeing them come back now, but there was a lot that were affected.
But head of recovery efforts, Orrit Connor, says overall the island bounced back relatively quickly.
We saw it in Bodden Town. We also saw it in East End. And East End was extremely fortunate because they had the company IAMCO, and they set up shop in East End, and they started to do work there to get people back in their homes. So, and that meant that government didn't have to place that much effort in that area because it was being taken care of, by them, despite the fact that later on, it might have been $5 million, might have been less than that, had been given to CIDB to manage, to help people get their homes repaired. And that was done by the government. And that was monies that didn't have to be repaid.
Forecasters have described Hurricane Ivan as a once-in-a-century event, a natural disaster on such an epic scale that is unlikely to strike the Cayman Islands again. However, across the board, businesses and government used Ivan as a teacher and upgraded their facilities, strategies, and preparedness plans just in case. Perhaps there's no better way to prepare for such an event than to experience it firsthand. At the end of the day, Deputy Chairman of the National Hurricane Committee, Donovan Ebanks, says this generation of Caymanians now know that you must be prepared come hurricane season, and you must never forget.
Every season brings that potential that you can be impacted, and it just behoves you to do the things today that can reduce your risks in the future. What we need to do is simply preserve the knowledge we have. What we got from Ivan was that we can all get by with a lot less resources and amenities, and we fight every day and work so hard to believe that we have to have. Power goes, you can only buy $25 at a supermarket, but you can still live.
Human nature is such that we can't help ourselves. We will always want to do better. We'll always want to bring ourselves back to some greater level than where we might find ourselves from time to time. So even when we're knocked down, I think the vast majority of people, and certainly Caymanians, will get up, get to it, get it done.
It was something that none of us had really experienced to that degree before. Having been able to witness it, Cayman as a whole pulled together and managed a situation that most countries our size could probably not have managed as adequately, and many who are much larger than us may not have handled as well.
Ivan taught us a lot. It taught us to remember where we came from and that we could survive. It also showed how resilient our people are and the strength that we possess. It's sad to say that it takes a catastrophe of that magnitude for us to look after each other. People rallied and helped and supported and looked out for each other. And that's what helped us to make it through.
Hurricane Ivan, The Struggle, The Sacrifice, The Strength was written and produced by Carsley Fuller, narrated by Dion Anglin, with contributions from Shonda Gallego and Jamie Tawil.
Radio station.
Radio Cayman is the voice of the Cayman Islands.